far out in the blue hemisphere of the Pacific, where the ocean folds in on itself like silk, and the stars rise unbroken from horizon to horizon. A triangle of volcanic earth lifts its dark shoulders above the tide, and stares back with stone eyes that never blink and never forget. Easter Island, or Rapa Nui, appears small on a map, a fleck of igneous breath, yet its silence has outlasted empires, and its mystery has unspooled across centuries, like a whisper that refuses to fade. Along its wind-polished coasts, the Moai stand sentinel, their faces turned inland, as if watching a memory the sea can no longer erase, inviting us closer with questions the air still carries. The island's bones are 3 volcanoes, long asleep: Maunga Teravaka, Rano Raraku, and Rano Kau, whose crater is a dark green mirror collecting rain and sky. Between them lie ancient lava flows and ash, slopes groomed by time, and a thin soil that remembers hands and tools and footsteps lost to the same ocean that gave them passage. The wind moves like a brush across the grass, uncovering obsidian flakes, adze fragments, and footprints of platforms known as ahu, each connected to lineages whose names taste of smoke and salt, resisting the erasures of forgetting. Rapa Nui lore speaks of a founding voyage guided by stars and swells, a canoe carried by knowledge that reads the ocean like a manuscript, arriving on a shore that felt both empty and destined. The tale of Hatu Matua is part history and part cradle song, a memory of navigators who crossed distances so vast that their maps were songs and their compasses were birds and clouds, arriving to claim a place that waited for hands to touch stone. Settlement timelines are debated, but the sensation remains. An intentional arrival, and a landscape that began to answer the human gaze with contours inviting sacred labor. From the beginning, stone became kin, and Rano Raraku became a living archive. The quarry where Moai began as outlines in volcanic tuff, the compressed ash that shapes easily yet ages with stubbornness. The Moai were not statues merely. They were presences, or rather conduits, ancestors given posture and face, so that their lineage could continue to hold the land, not as rulers, but as a membrane between the living and the invisible. Their bodies stand in stillness, but imply motion, with forward-leaning torsos and careful mouths, in the sense that watching is itself a form of protection. If you walk the island's roads, the old roads that curve and nod like the backs of sleeping whales, you pass ahu whose masonry is dry-fitted with precision that seems measured against wind itself. Many Moai rest toppled, their profiles softened by lichen, while others stand re-erected by modern hands, in careful dialogue with a past that wants both reverence and restraint. Some are crowned with red scoria topknots, called pukao, cylindrical and proud, their color recalling the island's ritual pigments, while others wear only the sky, as if remembering something the stone kept hidden. From the sea's perspective, the Moai appear to face away from arrival, turned instead toward the hearth of the island, watching gardens, springs, pathways, and silence. This inward gaze has been interpreted as a surveillance of belonging, a way to fix kinship onto topography, to anchor identity onto ridgelines and fields, to catch the breath of the living and push it gently back toward continuity. At certain moments, some bore white coral and obsidian pupils, the eyes installed during ceremonies that made them look alive, a transformation that might have sounded like a collective inhalation. The materials themselves tell a story of movement and choice. The bodies carved from the tuff of Rano Raraku, the topknots quarried from softer red scoria at Punapau, the adzes made of basalt harder than the dreams that wielded them. The logistics of extracting, shaping, and transporting such tonnage suggests planning, training, and authority wrapped in ritual, an economy of muscle anchored in belief. Around the quarry, half-freed giants lie embedded in the slope, as if swimming through the earth toward daylight, paused mid-migration by a decision or a catastrophe we still try to name. Some Moai were never meant to travel, say certain whispers. Others fell on the roads, and fractured like stories, interrupted by storm, their broken bodies becoming roadside lessons in ambition and fate. Along the inland paths, statues lie face down or face up, their features eroded into mute questions, and their necks like hinges that could not hold the weight of motion indefinitely. The roads themselves slope toward Ahu, with edges that function like curbs, perhaps guiding a ritual procession of stone, perhaps compensating for the peculiar physics of rocking beings forward. In a world of wind, red dust, and the unbroken arc of sky, why make so many faces, and why set them to watch? The answer stitched by archaeology speaks of lineage veneration, of mana flowing from ancestors into land, of territories maintained by stone eyes that did not sleep, while the answer stitched by rumor includes everything from lost civilizations to visitors from elsewhere, drawn by the audacity of stone it seems to walk. Between those answers lies a tension that feels like a bowstring pulled taut, vibrating with both wonder and absence. The Moai are not simply tall. They are scaled to surpass the human body so thoroughly that standing beside them feels like standing beside a cliff carved into a person. Measures vary. Some rise 3 or 4 meters, and others promise 10. One giant, still attached to the quarry, would have soared over 20 meters if fully born, a colossus we can only imagine moving. Each contour, each chisel mark frozen beneath lichen, seems less like craft and more like slow thunder captured in a human outline. A thunder that asks not how it was made, but why it needed to be so audacious. Facing inland, the Moai align with the ocean's hush behind them, yet their platforms nestle at the coastline in ways that suggest conversation with tides and hidden springs. A subtle mapping between stone faith and freshwater breath. Some researchers propose that Moai cluster near coastal seeps, where underground aquifers whisper through the porous rock. A meeting of geology and ancestor veneration that turns devotion into infrastructure. If true, the statues become guardians of water as much as of lineage, and the landscape becomes a palimpsest of worship and survival, written in the salt and salt. As evening settles over Ahu Tangariki, and the 15 silhouettes pull the last light into their narrow mouths, the island exhales, and the questions lift like frigate birds to roost in your imagination. The surf beats its slow pulse, matches the human heartbeat, and somewhere inland, the quarry dozes with half-shaped giants, still listening for footsteps that no longer come. Between the anchored and the abandoned, the moved and the unmoved, a gap opens, and inside that gap waits the oldest question of all. How do stones learn to travel, and what do they remember as they go? The wind cools, the night stretches, and the stars arrive in their ancient arithmetic, thrown like seeds across a black garden, watching the watchmen with indifferent patience. Each Moai seems to brace against time itself, not resisting but enduring, turning patience into architecture and absence into form. If we follow the tool marks back into the quarry and lean into the shadows where the first blows fell, perhaps the rhythm of stone will resolve into a pattern we can hear, leading us into the heart of the carving ground where the statues dreamed their first dreams. At Rano Raraku, the volcano's flank opens into a theater of stone, and the stage is crowded with profiles that rise from the earth, as if the hillside were a crowded audience holding its breath. Here the Moai were born, cut from tuff in a choreography that arranges the earth into conversation, each figure linked to bedrock, until the last moments when the island's gravity was outwitted by intent. The quarry face bears hundreds of silhouettes, some completed and upright, others half-released, the matrix stone still clinging to their backs, like a parent reluctant to let go. Tool marks blur into the slope, indicating adzes of hard basalt, striking tough in deliberate cadence, the lines shallow and rhythmic, a human heartbeat translated into stone. The carvers favored a sequence that seems consistent. Outline first, then face, then torso, then the long, lean back left attached to the rock until the moment of separation, when channels were cut beneath the figure to slide it free. Around them, the remains of workshops hum in quiet detail. Flakes, chips, and dust that once rose in clouds, settling into a fine memory that tastes faintly of iron and rain. No voices remain, yet organization radiates from the site like heat held in lava, suggesting teams with expertise, apprentices following hands more than words, and an economy of food, water, and ritual that fed the work. Basalt adzes were traded or carried from outcrops elsewhere on the island, the sharp edges renewed and curated, their polish a record of strokes counted in the thousands. The labor translated belief into geometry, and every stroke drew a lineage closer to visibility, summoning a face that would subsequently hold a community together in gaze and obligation. Scattered across the gentle slopes are moai, sunk up to their shoulders, giving rise to the misapprehension that they are only heads, when in fact, many have torsos embedded like seeds in earth. Excavations have revealed their hidden bodies, decorated with petroglyphs, arms carved close to the sides, hands resting low, and spines that resemble architectural ribs, suggesting a sculptural grammar, both standardized and expressive. These partially buried forms look toward the sky with an air of anticipation, as if their emergence were interrupted by a season that never ended, or by a shift in priorities that redefined what completion meant. Among them, one figure breaks the mold with intentional grace. Tukuturi, the kneeling statue, unique in posture, bearded, the legs folded beneath the body, the spine curved as if listening to a distant drum. Carved perhaps at a later time, its form hints that styles could evolve, that ritual could adapt, that even a tradition so codified could flex when winds changed. Tukuturi is a quiet pivot in stone, raising the possibility that the island's spiritual landscape was not a single monologue, but a dialogue that left traces in unexpected gestures. Some works are giants that test the imagination's muscle. An unfinished colossus still fused to the basaltic earth would have towered about 21 meters and weighed more than an implausible hope, a being that seems as ambitious as a mountain trying to learn to walk. Nearby lie intermediate giants, 10 meters and more, bodies that would have demanded teams, discipline, and a choreography of ropes, levers, and prayers to move a single heartbeat's length. The quarry keeps their secrets in proportions that feel like questions wearing bodies, each one a hypothesis about the limits of human resolve. In time, the release came. The moai separated from their cradles and guided downslope toward the island's circumferential paths, which coil like patient rivers. Once freed, the statues were trimmed and refined, their backs smoothed, their edges defined, and their center of mass coaxed into balance, suggesting a knowledge of stability that was empirical, accumulated, and profoundly bodily. The bodies lean forward subtly, a posture that seems not accidental, the kind of tilt that invites a particular method of movement, even if the precise technique remains an ache in the historical record. The completion of a moai was not a solitary achievement, but the opening of a ritual window, a period during which the statue could be prepared for its journey and its installation upon an ahu that waited like a stage. Coralline eyes were shaped and stored, red ochre pigments prepared, and the topknots at Punapau carved from soft red scoria, the cylinders rolled or slid outward from a coral-colored wound in the earth. The matching of body and crown, platform and gaze, required timing and ceremony. The exact choreography, a tapestry of gestures layered into silence. Rano Raraku holds its own eulogies carved into boulders and ground, petroglyphs of marine life, birds, geometric motifs, and the quiet recurrence of forms that repeat like prayers spoken into a steady wind. The patterns suggest that while the quarry was a factory of ancestors, it was also a shrine, a place where production and devotion braided into one experience that calmed and compelled. As the moai left, the site did not empty, but remained populated by abandoned ambitions, damaged faces, and instructions written in stone fragments rather than words. It is easy, standing there with grass brushing your ankles, and the slope warm underfoot, to imagine the procession beginning, ropes catching light, dust spooling up as hands press, chant, and adjust. Yet the road from quarry to coast was not just a line on the land, but a narrative with chapters of decision and chance, shifts in leadership and weather, the discreet surrenders that come when gravity insists on its story. Along that road lie Moai that never made it, and their inertness becomes a kind of commentary on all that did, a chorus of silence pointing to the persistence of those who learned to use stone as a verb. Pukao, the crater of red scoria, provided the topknots that once crowned many statues, and its interior carries the geometry of circles and cylinders like a soft echo of the human head. The material was lighter, though still heavy, and bears the marks of carving, pecking, and shaping into forms that could be rolled or maneuvered with deliberation and care. The placement of pukao upon completed statues would have been the final audacity, the sealing of identity that turned the Moai from a presence into a person, and from stone into ancestor. By the time the statues reached the coast, they were not merely objects, but accumulations of human attention, each scratch and polish a page in an unwritten ledger of intention and trust. To see them elevated on Ahu, aligned shoulder to shoulder, is to witness not only the completion of a task, but the beginning of a surveillance that is both spiritual and practical, a watch kept over water, crops, and kin. Yet even mounted, the figures seemed to hum faintly with movement, as if the idea of travel still flickered in their mass, awaiting the technique that modern minds still debate. Standing between the quarry and the shore, feeling the island's breath slide past, you can sense a method lost just beyond the edge of reach, like a tune you heard once and can almost recall. The stones do not answer questions on command. Instead, they hold the pause longer than you expect, letting the mind lean forward into the unknown until it steadies itself. At the edge of that pause, the road curves and the mystery of motion waits, inviting us to follow the faint drag marks, the curbs, and the fallen giants toward a demonstration that reveals itself only in fragments. Across the island, the ancient roads are more than paths. They are hypotheses pressed into soil, curving with the land's breath rather than cutting through it, edged by low berms that suggest guidance rather than force. Along these routes, archaeologists have traced the debris of movement, chips knocked off to reduce weight, platforms scraped by impact, and the orderly chaos of labor that accompanied each forward-leaning statue. The question that rises from every curve is as persistent as the wind. How did they move something so tall, so heavy, and so unforgiving, without metal, wheel, or beasts of burden? For decades, explanations have arrayed themselves like tides. Wooden sledges hauled over rollers, lubricated pathways greased by plant oils, and teams pulling in rhythm to gull the earth into cooperation. Each proposal must wrestle with evidence of limited timber, the curvature of roads ill-suited to straight dragging, and statues that lean forward as though inviting a technique more elegant than brute conveyance. The island refuses simple answers, and in that refusal, the conversation grows richer, not thinner, like a cord that gains strength when strands are added rather than removed. Thor Heyerdahl, the romantic of crossings, arrived in the mid-20th century with an appetite for possibility and a camera that made doubt look less convincing. In experiments, small statues were hauled with ropes, tilted and pulled, while logs creaked beneath them, the friction singing a song that sounded like both triumph and wear. Yet the image of massed rollers scraping a denuded island into exhaustion fails to harmonize neatly with the road curbs, the leaning geometry, and the number of fallen Moai along routes where rolling might not suffice. Later, a different rhythm emerged, the notion of walking statues, rocked forward by ropes and leverage, pivoting from side to side like a refrigerator guided through a doorway, the glide composed of micro-falls arrested by human timing. In the 1980s, experiments showed that with 3 teams and taut ropes, a replica could be coaxed into motion, its base pivoting like a foot, the forward lean accommodating the transfer of weight. Decades on, a 5-ton model was walked downslope by coordinated pulls and releases, its movement eerie and persuasive, a mechanical waltz that felt like a memory waking. The design supports the dance. Many moai have D-shaped bases with rounded front edges that invite rocking, and a center of mass that sits forward in ways counterintuitive if the goal were stable dragging. Chisel work on lower edges reveals polish consistent with pivoting rather than scraping, and the road's curbs could have stabilized sideways drift while allowing the gentle serpentine required by a walking method. Watching the replicas move, it becomes easy to imagine chance fitting into the steps, not as mystical requirements, but as metronomes of muscle and coordination. Fallen statues along the routes become more legible in this light, their fractures marking the moments when an edge caught wrong, or a rope failed, or an angle met gravity with unforgiving precision. Face-down bodies suggest forward momentum, interrupted by a stumble, while face-up rests hint at adjustments or pauses, the human tendency to tip a heavy thing back on its heels to catch breath. The trail of wrecks can read pessimistically as failure, but it can also be a map of learning, a record of communities, pushing the technique to its limits and beyond. When the moai finally reached their ahu, another challenge remained, raising them to vertical and often crowning them with a topknot that had traveled from Punapo like a red planet rolling into orbit. Ramps of stone and soil likely grew like gentle tongues beside platforms, allowing the statue to be levered upright, shims removed, and weight settled onto a prepared bed with careful, hushed adjustments. The placing of pukao massive cylinders of scoria may have used separate ramps or cradle systems, the physics of stacking daring enough to qualify as daily miracle rather than legend. Faces came alive with eyes installed in ceremony, coral whites fitted with dark pupils of obsidian or red scoria, the gaze sharpened into a watch that connected ritual to surveillance. The presence of eyes was not constant. Some moai may have worn them only during festivals, suggesting that activation was modulated according to season and need, like lamps switched on at night. When the gaze was present, it must have altered the air itself, infusing the platforms with a sense of mind behind stone, a reciprocal seeing that bound people to place through attention. Ahu themselves are masterworks of dry stone engineering, their faces smooth, their backs nuanced with fill and retaining walls, built to endure salt, wind, and the steady tremor of the Pacific's mood swings. Some align with solar events, capturing solstice light across their length, while others seem oriented to winds or waves, embedding the geometry of season into architecture. The coexistence of astronomical cues and water proximity suggests an integrated design where cosmology, hydrology, and ancestry met, each informing the placement of stone and the direction of a gaze that remains with us in photographs and dreams. The island's largest restored ceremonial complex, Ahu Taungariki, suffered the force of a 1960 tsunami that scattered its statues like driftwood, testament to the sea's unanswerable veto. Decades later, a restoration gathered them again, engineering and devotion intertwined, cranes rehearsing motions that echoed the ancient choreography in steel and hydraulics. The re-erected line faces the island with dignity and a faint melancholy, a modern epilogue to the original performances of placement that left so little behind in text and so much in mass. Near Anakina, the sandy cradle of a possible first landing, coral eyes were found, their ovals bright even under dust, proof that the Moai's gaze was not purely symbolic, but tactile, installed, and capable of being taken away. The discovery ripples backward through the centuries, asking us to imagine ceremonies when the eyes were lifted toward sockets, and the statue became a someone that could not be mistaken for a something. In that moment, the landscape must have shivered with elation and responsibility, and the air would have cooled around a presence now awake. As the tradition matured, intensified, and then changed, some moai were toppled, deliberately perhaps, their faces snuffed of sight, their crowns rolled aside into mute redness, their platforms scarred by choices made under pressures we are still mapping. The toppling is not a neat line of cause and effect. It is a discontinuity scattered across the island, suggesting conflict, adaptation, or ritual sunset, a closing of one era so that another could dawn. In that threshold, the Birdman cult rises like a shape in fog, and the faces that once watched fields now dream from the grass as another set of eyes takes the stage. High above the sea at Rano Raraku, a caldera holds a mosaic of marsh and water, a green eye set in basalt, lidded by clouds that graze the rim as if resting. On a lip of this crater, the village of Rongorongo clings to stone, its houses sunk into the earth like commas pausing between breaths, staring across to the black nests of Rapa Nui and its companion islets. Here the island's attention shifted, and a new ritual moved into prominence, not erasing the Moai, but overlaying them with a rite of agility, risk, and seasonal return. The Birdman ceremony carried the island's hope across water as competitors descended cliff faces, swam with reed floats through shark watch channels, and waited on hungry rocks for the season's first sooty turn egg. Whoever's sponsor returned with the egg became the Tangata Manu, the Birdman, a sacred personage for a year, connecting the community to fertility and cycle through daring, performed with the sea as witness. Petroglyphs at Rongorongo inscribed this rite into stone. Stylized birdmen crouched and watchful, masks of the deity make, and tangled lines that speak in a language of line and curve rather than vocabulary. This shift did not necessarily mean the Moai were forgotten. More likely, it signals adaptation, a society recalibrating around new pressures, environmental or social, folding old devotions into a new ceremonial calendar. The statues remained, their gaze undimmed by physical descent, while the live ritual moved to cliffs and ocean, the island rebalancing the axis between land and sea. The toppling of Moai across many sites hints at political conflict, incentive shifting, or a deliberate deactivation of gazes whose power had been claimed by rival lineages or repurposed by a changing cosmology. The old and seductive narrative says the island toppled under the weight of its own ambition, that forests fell to feed rollers and sledges until nothing remained but stumps and regret, a morality tale carved in tuff. Newer readings complicate this with evidence of rats gnawing palm seeds, slow climate shifts, and adaptive agriculture that produced rock gardens, windbreaks, and manavai circular walled enclosures that nurtured crops with warmth and shelter. The people of Rapa Nui may have been more resilient than pessimism allowed, shaping a landscape of lithic mulching that captured heat and moisture, a stone garden that whispered endurance. Water shaped every decision, though it rarely announced itself on the surface, slipping instead through porous basalt to emerge as brackish seeps at the coast, where fresh and salt met in careful truce. Caves became reservoirs of coolness and trickle, their walls painted with symbols that preserved moments, stories, and perhaps even celestial reckoning, becoming both sanctuary and archive. To walk the island is to see survival written in technique. The strategic placement of gardens, the harnessing of dew and shade, and the awareness that stone could both shelter and store. Weapons in this landscape look like tools more than theater. Obsidian mata, pointed flakes that could serve as knives, scrapers, or projectiles. Their ubiquity, a reminder that daily life and conflict share artifacts. Studies suggest they were multi-purpose rather than specialized for killing, complicating narratives of endemic warfare, even as scars on statues and walls testify to periods of unrest and disassembly. The island resists singular explanations with the same grace that its statues resist blinking, holding multiple truths side by side and asking us to accept a braided reality rather than a single strand. European sails cut the horizon in 1722 when the Dutch commander Jacob Roggeveen sighted Rapa Nui on Easter Sunday, a calendrical accident that gave the island a name that is both accurate and oblivious. Encounters were brief and charged, gifts exchanged, misunderstandings sown, and observations recorded through the narrow lens of external expectation. The Moai noted with astonishment, but without comprehension of their living context. Later visits by Spanish, English, and French navigators added layers of description, sometimes contradictory, always partial, like trying to describe a song by looking at the instrument. The 19th century's cruelty arrived as if it had been waiting for a map. Peruvian slavers raided the island in the 1860s, abducting a large portion of the population, among them spiritual leaders and knowledge holders, leaving behind grief and gaps where ceremonies and lineages once stood. Disease followed in waves, the population collapsed, and missionary efforts, however sincere or controlling, reshaped practice and memory, moving bodies and beliefs into new configurations and silences. With the loss came a winnowing of knowledge, a thinning of ritual that left questions like footprints without owners. Out of this difficult century rises a tantalizing script carved on wooden tablets and staffs called Rongorongo, a cascade of glyphs that flow in Bustrafiden, reversing direction line by line like a field plowed by invisible oxen. The glyphs depict humans, birds, fish, geometric patterns, and shapes that hint at counting or rhythm, but their language remains undeciphered, the key perhaps scattered with those taken or silenced, or perhaps hidden where no one has yet thought to look. Whether Rongorongo is pre-contact or a post-contact adaptation remains debated, and the tablets themselves bear a patina of use and reuse, as if history tried to write itself back into being. Scholars of the early 20th century listened and recorded as islanders shared what they knew. Expeditions mapped, photographed, and speculated, their curiosity genuine, but bounded by frameworks that often mistook absence for failure rather than loss. Some theories wandered far from the Pacific, weaving in outsiders and lost continents, projecting fantasies onto reality, as if the island were a blank canvas, rather than a text in a language outsiders had not learned to read. The Moai seemed to invite this, their silence so eloquent that many felt compelled to write their own meanings upon it, ignoring the quiet insistence of the stones to be taken on their own terms. Still, certain moments of listening bear fruit. Place names preserve memory, rituals echo in modified form, and the geometry of gardens remembers droughts better than stories do, their layout a response to problems whose return we can anticipate. The island's people, living descendants of those who carved and carried stone, hold in their bodies and daily choices knowledge that does not seek research approval to be true. The interplay between outside interpretation and inside endurance continues, a negotiation where respect must learn to move at the pace of rain. At Orongo, the wind lifts as evening approaches, and the seabirds tack their angled wings through the last gold light, and the motifs of birdmen glimmer faintly on damp stone. The Moai, miles away, sense nothing we can measure, yet the island feels braided again, not in opposition of cults, but in the layering of meanings across time, as adaptable as the ocean that both isolates and connects. In that layering, an unfinished sentence remains, one that the next century will try to complete with soil cores, genetic studies, and the delicate art of reading stone. Modern tools reach into old puzzles with gentleness and a steady hum, and Rapa Nui yields data like seeds shaken from a careful hand, each detail small, together forming a field. Radiocarbon dates drift toward a consensus of settlement around the 13th century, aligning the arrival of people with volcanic soils still raw enough to invite planting and belief. Pollen cores sketch a forest of palms declining over time, not as a single calamity, but as a complex ache, with rodents nibbling at regeneration and people negotiating scarcity with innovation rather than surrender. Isotopes in bones whisper of diet, a balance of crops like sweet potato and taro, softened by seafood and pelagic fish, a menu that shifts with climate and garden design, and with access to coasts and caves. The sweet potato's own genetics suggest a journey from the Americas to Polynesia before Europeans carried their maps. implying contact across the world's largest blue space by navigators, who read waves as if they were sentences. Whether Rapa Nui's own people met Americans before first European landfall remains unresolved, a question with answers that move like shadows when you try to hold them still. The function of the Moai continues to deepen under scrutiny that asks not only what they did symbolically, but what they did materially in the literal service of life. Studies correlating statue density with the presence of freshwater seeps along the coast propose that the lineages placed their stone guardians where water could be accessed, converting veneration into wayfinding. If true, the gaze of the ancestors becomes not merely metaphysical, but practical, directing attention to where the earth breathes drinkable air through rock, and turning devotion into hydrology under the guise of reverence. Agricultural landscapes confirm the island's ingenuity. Fields armored with stones to trap heat and reduce evaporation, windbreaks curling like sleeping snakes around patches of hope, and manavas circles warming roots while shielding leaves. These stones worked invisibly, shifting microclimates by degrees that meant survival, a quiet technology that turned geology into agriculture and repetition into resilience. The Moai watched over this craft, not as idols demanding sacrifice, but as reminders that attention itself is a sacred act, and that tending is a form of prayer measured in harvests rather than hymns. Conservation now contends with the slow insistence of time and the accelerated uncertainties of a warming world, where salt, wind, and fire gather into new vocabularies of loss. Storms bite at the shorelines, tsunamis remind stone of humility, and drought lifts its dry hand against the island's gardens and hearts, while recent fires have scorched the quarry's waking faces into a deeper sleep. The stone endures, but the skin of lichen and patina that the centuries painted is fragile, and the hands now tending them must balance intervention with respect, effort with restraint. Restoration has its own poetry. Ahu Tongdariki reassembled with steel and care, cranes arching like mechanical herons over the coastline, and local knowledge guiding the hands that bolt and brace without overriding. Teams from Rapa Nui and beyond collaborate, and the island inhabits a new kind of network, cameras and sensors monitoring salt and stress, while elders recount genealogies that tether stones to names and coves. Each successful raising is a salute not only to past builders, but to present stewards, the lineage of care continuing across technologies and norms. The 20th century visitors who gave the world images of walking statues and quarries filled with half-born giants remain part of the narrative, their flaws and insights alike folded into the sediment of understanding. Not all theories aged well, and some romanticism hardened into myth that misled as often as it inspired, while later experiments disciplined wonder into repeatable demonstrations that clarified more than they obscured. The island seems to forgive this in the way cliffs forgive waves, by surviving and by changing slowly, insisting that every hypothesis bend to evidence and every story attach itself to the ground. Meanwhile, the living community renews its language, rituals, and claims to land, pushing back against reductions that turn homeland into exhibit, arguing that sacred is not preserved by museum glass alone. Festivals knit the present to the past with music and carving. Children learn names that once fell silent, and elders' voices carry across windy fields where gardens are rebuilt with old stones and new hope. Tourism breathes resources and pressure in equal measure, and the island's guardians negotiate how many feet a path can bear before it becomes a wound rather than a visit. On calm nights, the Moai resemble syllables in an unwritten poem, each one carrying a fragment of meaning that makes sense only as part of the line, and then only in the presence of tide and wind. Some face platforms blackened by time and ritual, others lean slightly as if listening, their presence a patient insistence that mysteries do not vanish when named, they simply grow roots. The gaze is still inland, the watch still active, the conversation between stone and soil ongoing in a language without verbs for hurry, without nouns for conquest. The undeciphered script of Rongorongo flickers at the edge of this, wood worn smooth, glyphs arranged in orders that reverse like tides, content sealed for now behind a door of lost context. Scholars try frequency counts, comparative motifs, and statistical ghosts searching for phonetics, while oral histories gesture at chant and memory work that carried meaning without needing oak to hold it. The tablets persist in archives and memory, their figures stoic and playful by turns, inviting a decoding that may come someday not from a computer, but from a voice that remembers how to sing them. At night, the Milky Way drops its veil across Rapa Nui so close it feels like dew, and the canoe of stars rides the zenith like a map unrolled for those who still know how to read it. The Moai, unblinking, receive starlight that left long before the first ads touched tough, and their bodies absorb its coolness with composure that resists sentimentality. In this light, the lines between myth, science, and memory blur, and the island seems less like a puzzle to solve than a companion to travel with, patient, exacting, and generous. You stand at the lip of an ahu and listen to the waves count themselves against rock, and you realize the Moai's greatest lesson may be the conversion of time into attention, of stone into story, of questions into a form of belonging. The unanswered parts are not failures but invitations, and the enduring parts are not monuments but agreements, between people and place, between ancestors and descendants, between wind and those who inhale it. Somewhere inland, a carved body sleeps in earth up to its shoulders, waiting for a century that may yet unbury it gently and listen without rushing. Before you drift into sleep, remember mystery is never truly lost, only waiting to be found. If you enjoyed this journey, subscribe for more relaxing ancient mysteries, and let your curiosity guide you deeper.